presentations as well. We're doing those maybe one last time, possibly one more semester because of fewer conferences because of COVID. So if you saw multiple emails, that's why that's happening. But thanks for coming today. We have, I think, we only have 4 presenters today. Everybody has 25 minutes to present and 5 minutes for questions. During the question and answer period, you can type your question into the chat, and then presenters, if you can read the question and before you answer it, that would be great because it would be captured in the recording. I will post the link to the peer review form in the chat here in a minute, but everybody should fill out an evaluation for everyone else. Actually, I sent you all an email. I think you each have to do half of the class. So just pay attention to which ones, since we have so many people presenting, you don't have to do everyone. But without talking anymore, I have hit record. And Maeve, whenever you are ready, you can go ahead and start talking. Oh, you're muted, Maeve.
How about now?
There we go.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Hi, I'm Maeve Stevens, and my presentation today is on the Colorado Front Range Conservation Easements, GIS land valuation, and hedonic modeling. For those of you who don't know, the Front Range basically stretches from Colorado to Wyoming, and it's called the Front Range because it's the gateway to the Rockies. Hedonic modeling will take a little more explanation, so I'll get on with that. So, conservation easements are a legally binding mechanism to protect natural resources in perpetuity. These resources include those vital to all life, such as air, soil, and water. Americans have been fortunate thus far in not facing life-threatening shortages of these resources, but they're already often impaired. Certainly here where I live in Salt Lake, the air quality is often impaired. Motivations for land conservation vary by landowner, but a demonstrated financial benefit likely incentivizes conservation. This study will examine the spatial distribution of land values to determine whether values are influenced by proximity to conservation easements and whether different types of easements have different levels of influence. The primary research hypothesis is that land values will increase with proximity to conservation easements. Specifically, urban land values will be higher the greater the proximity to permanent conservation easements, those that are based on scenic, habitat, and public access conservation values. I also believe that land values will increase in rural areas in proximity to agricultural and timber conservation easements, but to a lesser degree. The expectation is that the data will illuminate a strong connection between wealth, amenities, and the presence of conservation easements. Because conservation easements benefit all forms of life by protecting resources necessary for existence, it's crucial to understand how they influence property values in rural and urban contexts so that conservation efforts can be optimized. My problem statement is pretty straightforward. Intense development pressure is evident throughout the West, especially the Rocky Mountain region. According to the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program in 2016, the already populous Colorado front is predicted to grow another 70% in the next few decades. The pandemic has further highlighted that natural and rural landscapes attract residents. Many upscale Western communities, towns, and cities maintain extensive wild open space in addition to groomed dirt and paved trails and parks. The combination of highly sought after amenities and population migration into Colorado has increased development pressures, causing real estate prices to increase dramatically, especially during the pandemic. Residents are concerned about the changes in the character of these areas brought about by intensive rapid development. As a result, residents seek ways to conserve the landscapes they inhabit. The passage of open space bonds to purchase conservation easements and open space are clear indicators that the communities value protected land. Significant donations of conservation easements to land trusts with or without tax benefits to the landowner are also a clear signal that residents value land protection. The purpose of this study is to examine the relationships between assessed property values, the dependent variable, and conservation easements, the independent variable, and ask the following questions. To what degree do conservation easements impact adjacent property values? What impact do different conservation easement programs have on property values? Programs such as the NRCS Agricultural Conservation Easement Program and the U.S. Forest Service Legacy Program. And finally, what role do mountain amenities and socio-demographic and economic context play in property values? The primary objective of this research is to create a hedonic model of conservation easements' impacts on property values across a range of socioeconomic and demographic and urban to rural contexts. Basically, I'll look at spatial patterns and examine spatial autocorrelation, evaluating patterns for randomness. The hedonic model will utilize regression to define the relative importance of variables such as conservation easement proximity in relation to land value. This introduction is basically a long way of saying that currently land planning is skewed towards development as opposed to conservation. This literature review confirms strong connections between open space and conservation easements, protection and proximal home price increases, and even tax revenue increases. Some authors go so far as to postulate that within certain parameters, conservation easements held by public entities can increase tax revenue to the point that the easements are actually self-funded. According to Gosnell and Abrams, 2009, migration to rural areas throughout the world in this era is driven primarily by the presence of natural and cultural amenities, citing migration to health spa-oriented Bath, UK as an early example. This has certainly been borne out by massive population shifts during the recent pandemic. Americans are moving from urban centers to non-metropolitan areas in rates not seen since at least 2012, to include locations such as ski areas within the Colorado Front Range. And that's according to Frey 2022 and Spaldi 2022. Frey emphasized, however, that an urban to less urban trend was present in the US West prior to the pandemic between 2010 and 2020. Kolko et al. 2021 echo this assertion, demonstrating that the pandemic heightened already present trends of cities in warm locations, smaller cities, and vacation destinations gaining population through migration from larger traditional cities, mostly New York and San Francisco. Fossold and Lelahome, 1999, compared the costs to municipal budgets per acre of open space versus developed land and found overwhelmingly that open space returned a value on cost outlays, while residential development often cost more than it returned. In one example, in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York, on average, open space cost 29 cents versus $1.13 for every dollar for developed land and respective services required. Freegood and Wagner, 1992, as cited in Fossold and Lelahome, 1999. The basic concept is that like cows or trees don't require the police to respond or infrastructure. To gain a federal tax break for establishing a conservation easement under IRS Code 170H, a public benefit must be present. So this is conservation, not preservation. This can be in the form of recreation opportunities, scenic viewshed, the presence of a historic structure, or resources present supporting a federally delineated policy, such as one protecting endangered species. Additional supporting conservation values include preservation of natural space, habitat, to include water resources, and space adjacent to other conserved or protected open space, creating migration corridors. Agricultural land protected values include productive soil, grazing lands, historical or archaeological resources, and land supporting a relevant soil policy. Wetland easements support both restoration and preservation of wetland areas. NRCS, no date. For land value, it's easy to compare the value of a 2-bedroom home with a 3-bedroom home, but is an alpine meadow more valuable than a conifer forest? German et al. 2000 takes a fresh look at fundamental concepts of land valuation, arguing that traditional appraisal methods cannot possibly capture value properly for land without buildings present. The approach argues for a redefinition of neighborhood for comparables to a larger jurisdictional scale, and for insertion of more sophisticated spatial analysis of general characteristics such as regional context and lot size. Strong spatial element there. This sounds like an attempt at harnessing the power of big data, but not enough detail about the actual model was provided. More specific methods used in this type of analysis were captured in Ward et al. 1999's approach for improving traditional appraisal models via GIS. This article detailed considerations of small variations in neighborhoods and the impacts that these variations can have on property value. Their model was based on specific influencers like a parcel of open space in the regional and local context. This approach seems more relevant to my study, but requires computer-assisted mass appraisal, CAMA models, and appraisal expertise, both of which I don't have. Similarly, Seidel et al. 2020 examined 3 different ways to value land, to include traditional appraisals in Colorado. They found that different approaches benefit urban and rural scenarios, with the main distinction being development pressure. The main benefit of this study is the consideration of how to value environmental services absent development pressure. They also introduce a matrix for considering public benefit, lending objectivity to a somewhat subjective process. Since they did not include any GIS modeling, this article is only helpful in considering land valuation techniques. For spatial statistics, Hybert and Allen, 2019, confirmed the view of this study that traditional market valuation often does not explicitly capture valued amenities such as forested areas. The authors detail their approach to hedonic modeling using data from a county in North Carolina, but the real value of this article is the emphasis on the 2 regression models. They use ordinary least squares and geographically weighted regression. A limitation of this study is that it focuses simply on forest views and proximity to forested and agricultural areas and the impact on home sale price in just Greenville County in North Carolina. For hedonic modeling, Nazir et al. 2015 specifically used it to examine the impact of a botanical garden on housing prices in Malaysia. This study is of value because specific coefficients for the regression analysis for the hedonic modeling are detailed. A serious limitation, however, was the lack of inclusion of statistical error information, and the percent of variables accounted for was also absent. TREG 2010 uses hedonic modeling to assess the value of parks and open space and urban spaces in Baltimore, Maryland, and suburban surrounds. A major limitation of this study is that they ignored the very real impact of crime haven parks on property value, especially within Baltimore. The key value of this study is the very specific hedonic approach detailed. Bastian et al. 2002 used hedonic modeling in GIS to examine environmental amenities and agricultural land values absent development pressure. The authors consider traditional market values captured through discounted productive rents, but also attempt to value rural amenities such as wildlife and recreational space. The main limitation of this study is that it only considers agricultural land in the Rocky Mountain region. Kling et al. 2015 focus on urban and rural sprawl and its effect on residential property values in Larimer County in Colorado. This study area is helpful in examining wealthy, amenity-rich locations, as they note many seasonal second homes and a mountain landscape. A further benefit is their detailed discussion of hedonic model limitations and variables. It is well established that in general, open space increases surrounding property values, whether in the US or abroad. According to Reeves et al. 2018, main influences on increased property value include the ability to be developed, of course, proximity, and type of forest, coniferous versus deciduous. This study did not consider the impact of scenic viewshed for non-proximal properties. The authors posited a scheme whereby public conservation easement entities could reap the benefits of increased property values and therefore property tax increases to finance future conservation easements. Middle 2014 expands on the influences on value by examining various types of open space in addition to conservation easements in a small city and county seat in Massachusetts, roughly an hour from Boston. Middle also considered proximity, but added views of the property and environmental amenities and ecosystem services more explicitly. Middle also defined and explored varying concepts of proximity. Middle notes a lack of research on conservation easement, specifically value impact on house prices. Another unique approach from this author includes an examination of negative impacts from conservation easements and open space, such as farmyard odors and crime in urban parks. VUTS's 2017 studied the impact on apartment prices in Helsinki, Finland, of parks, forests, and fields. While VUTS's did not look at conservation easements specifically, many of the land values explored are similar and could be applied to conservation easements. The urban focus is also of interest. The study seems to consider the widest range of ecosystem services, such as pollution mitigation, including noise pollution, health, and stormwater management impacts. Discussion of spatial regression model details are helpful to include ordinary least squares and spatial error models. VUTSIS acknowledged the possibility of spatial autocorrelation more than most studies as well, and this is of value because the study also demonstrated how the impact was mitigated by augmenting the hedonic models. Many leads on spatial regression analysis and hedonic modeling were provided, to include naming the pioneers in the process. Now on to the literature review conclusion and literature gaps. Previous research shows that forests, parks, fields, open spaces, and natural habitats impact housing prices. Additionally, agricultural conservation easements impact housing prices in suburban and urban areas. However, there's still a gap in the literature in synthesizing the impact of specifically conservation easements on land valuation, as this relationship was not clear in previous studies. On to methodology. One alternative framework for land valuation is the Green Infrastructure Initiative, Monos Criado no date. Advances in GIS allow for more sophisticated land valuation, placing properties in a broader context, according to German et al. 2000. For this latter example, location analysis and land value mapping techniques incorporate valuation of adjacent properties, not just one-off comparisons of comparable properties. In other words, the individual property value incorporates the broader context of the area's value. Hedonic modeling will predict likely areas for easements for each scenario. For example, farm easements are likely to occur when development pressure increases. In wealthy areas, easements are likely to be placed when viewsheds are at risk. This study will identify contributing factors. Finally, this study will compare each scenario with ideal areas for protection from an environmental perspective solely, using the Nature Conservancy's resilient land mapping tool and green infrastructure concepts. This study will examine the spatial distribution of land value in conjunction with the location of conservation easements through the Colorado Front Range. Derived data will determine to what degree conservation easements affect surrounding land value and which other factors are influential. For data and materials, this study will utilize a combination of existing and derived open source and publicly available geographic information system data. It'll range from national down to local and county level data. Colorado is nice in the sense that they are very publicly open with their data. For analysis and methods, I'll use a combination of descriptive analysis, spatial statistics, and hedonic modeling. For descriptive analysis, I'll look at 3 different representative counties to symbolize a lower socioeconomic condition county, rural lands with low population density, and a high plains mountain environment. And I'll also look at a county that represents higher socioeconomic status with higher population density and more access to formal mountain amenities like ski resorts in Aspen. I'll use several different tools to include creating random points, pairwise intersect tool, point to raster tool, so that I can look at land value via kernel density analysis. I'll also very closely look at spatial statistics. I'll use spatial autocorrelation, global Moran's I analysis for the resultant kernel density layer will determine if the pattern is random. Regression analysis will assist in determining which independent variables impacted the dependent variable of land value, and the residual will indicate prediction accuracy for my model. Within that hedonic modeling, I'll look very closely at quite a few variables. So far, I'm interested in proximity, plant and wildlife presence, habitat, soils, scenic viewshed, climate resilience, parcel size, water resources, continuity to other protected spaces, recreational opportunities, historic or agricultural structures, support of conservation plans, development threat, and even landowner circumstances. As previous authors have demonstrated strong links in localized areas between the presence of various types of natural spaces and increased housing values, to include Bastian et al. I won't read all those are on the slide. This study anticipates discovery of a strong correlation between the emplacement of traditional conservation easements and a rise in surrounding property values. Further, this study anticipates that agricultural and timber resource conservation easements will also raise surrounding property values, but to a lesser extent due to potential negative characteristics, such as farmyard odors and dust from agricultural use, and noise and industrial disruption from timber management and use. I've outlined my research schedule here. I need to explore how to capture specific factors such as blue ribbon trout streams and data sets, but primarily I'll be going through an iterative process to redefine the hedonic model and the variables. And finally, I have a target and hopeful graduation in May of 2023. I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Floor, and I have a list of my references here. And if anyone has any questions for me, I will field those. It sounds like they're going to go into the chat, and then I'll Were there any questions? I'm happy to speak.
Yeah, great job. Everybody, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. And maybe if you can read them before answering. But really good job there. And I don't see any yet, but I'm sure people are typing. And while they're coming in, I was just wondering if, it looks like Brandy has a question, but I was just wondering if you have any ideas of where you might present this.
Oh, I haven't gotten that far. I'm thinking, because I actually work for a land trust, that it might be more beneficial for my career to actually do kind of a peer-reviewed article. But I'm open to suggestions on that as well. If the conference is a better networking venue, that makes sense too.
No, a published paper would be fantastic.
Okay, great.
Okay, it looks like you're getting some good questions.
Okay, from Brandy, I have, since the geographically weighted regression requires shapefiles, what will I use as my boundaries? So I've how will I justify which data to include in my model? So I've selected 3 counties within the Colorado front. So I'm not actually looking at the entire Colorado front, nothing from Wyoming. I've tried to choose counties that are kind of rural, as opposed to, like, say, Boulder or Denver, so that I have kind of a clear delineation between rural and urban environments, and some that are more likely to have more agricultural easements. And then I definitely wanted to cover the ski kind of areas, well, and mountain biking. So then the next question is from Anthony Robinson. Oh, and I'm sorry, did that answer your question, Brandy?
Yes. Well, did you answer the question about which data you'll justify in your model?
Yes, my way to kind of handle that is to break it down by county, representative counties. All right, so from Anthony, he's curious to know if I plan to include school district information as part of the considered factors. Oops, sorry, I lost it. Because it's such an influential attribute here in State College. I hadn't considered it, but I think that's a great idea. That I think would speak to kind of the different population demographics, and yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna write that down.
Yeah, I was just I actually just sold my house here like 3 days ago, and we're building a new house, and in certain places, I mean, like the Boulder, Denver area, I'm sure there's got to be dynamics around school districts as well. My sister lives in Boulder, but she doesn't have a kid in school, so it doesn't matter to her. But I was curious about that as a potential confounding factor in that mixture, and that may shift things one direction or another. But I also suspect that that is highly dependent on local conditions for other things. So like right here in our particular setting in State College, there's like a particular school district that a lot of people would like to be in, and then a lot of the surrounding ones are not nearly as desirable. So it's a really strong, like, it would be I'm sure the single most explanatory factor. So anyway, great talk, and I'm looking forward to see your results.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I agree that I could see that being a very important attribute for land value. All right. Brandy had a question about the ordinary least squares results and kind of evaluating for autocorrelation. So yes, I'm not there yet, but I do think that there are going to be some factors that are similar, because obviously, kind of just to speak to the school district one, if it's a higher land value area, it's probably pretty likely that the schools are also very well funded. So I do think there are going to be I'll kind of have to work through the variables. I think that'll be part of the iterative process to make sure that I'm not kind of double dipping on those variables.
And you probably saw a couple comments there too from your advisor and from Adrian. Okay, well, if we don't have any other questions, again, thanks, Maeve. That was a great presentation. We will keep moving along here. So our next presenter is Chet Chambora. And if you want to go ahead and share your screen, Chet, and then start talking whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Okay. So. Okay. Okay, so hello, everyone. My name is Chet Chambora, and this is the presentation for my capstone project for GEOG 596A. The title is Detecting Solar Panel Arrays Using a Convolutional Neural Network to Analyze Their Development on Agricultural Land in Massachusetts. And I know that's a mouthful, but I'll describe everything shortly. The basic purpose of my project is to analyze the conversion of agricultural land in Massachusetts. And with respect to one specific driver of that change, which is the installment of solar panels. And so there are several things that sparked my interest in this topic. One was the noticeable growth of solar arrays in my area of Massachusetts, especially along roadsides and in open areas. Another was my experience working on a farm, and that farm had solar installations actually put on it, and hearing anecdotally of other farms having solar panels kind of aroused my interest on this. And so finally, in my project, I'm going to be using what's called a machine learning model to answer some of the questions of my project. And so I'm going to be using this project kind of as a vehicle to learn more about machine learning and its applications for GIS. So why is my project important? Well, I think we can all agree that farmland is an important resource, and that anything that could be reducing that or curtailing that is something that the public should be made aware of. And so farmland is important for a variety of reasons, including food security and just for the landscape value that it provides. And so there's been several advances in machine learning, especially in image segmentation, which my project will employ. And so with my project, I hope to contribute a customized machine learning model to the body of knowledge, and then post it online so that it'll be able to be reused by others in the field. So just to give a little bit of background on the trends in farmland. So Massachusetts lost 15% of its farmland from 1997 to 2007. And so in the chart on the right, you can see the precipitous drop from 1997 to 2002. And then from 2012 to 2017, there was also a noticeable drop. And so over that time period, the average farm has been getting smaller. And there are several reasons for this. One you can imagine would be selling land for house building and other kinds of development. So as land prices have increased overall, it makes sense for a lot of farmers to just sell their land or lease it instead of trying to continue the risky operation of farming on that same land. And so to provide more foundation, we can also look at the growth of solar panels in the state. So since 2008, solar panels have dramatically increased in Massachusetts. And with this other chart here, you can see the growth of commercial solar arrays. And so these would be arrays that have been put on the ground or over large buildings, not the rooftop solar panels. And so you can see, especially after 2012, that the number just skyrocketed. And it's plateaued a bit, but it continues to increase over time. And so Massachusetts is ranked 10th for solar development in 2021 over the entire United States. And from my research, I found that old farmland sites are prime locations for solar arrays. And so just to give one quick example, an 800 panel solar array was put up in a town near me. And the developer said the reason that he put it up there was because it was an old farmland site and it was very easy to develop because it was cleared of trees and it was generally flat. And so finally, just to give a little background about the regulatory environment in Massachusetts. So federal and state programs encourage solar development in the state. The most recent one in Massachusetts is the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target Program, or SMART program, and that provides monetary incentives for homeowners and developers to put solar panels up. And the Zoning Enabling Act of Massachusetts in 2016 prevents towns from unreasonable regulation of solar panels. So towns can't put up any bylaws that unreasonably prevent people or companies from erecting solar arrays. And finally, the Massachusetts Carbon Reduction Program, which is our overall target for renewable energy, promotes future construction of solar panels. So we can guess that in the future, there will probably be more and more solar arrays erected. So with this background of knowledge, I asked a few questions. And so one is, how much farmland or land in general is occupied by solar arrays in the state? And no one really knows exactly, but I hope to find out with this project. And so another question I have is, how have solar arrays grown over time? So it's not just the most current footprints of solar panels, but how have they grown spatially over time? And in what areas or counties have they been most profuse in? These are questions that I would like to answer. So these kinds of questions have been asked elsewhere. And one reason that they would be asked is to understand the power capacity of solar arrays. So if that data is not available online, people will actually do studies such as this to find the total power capacity. But for my purposes, I'm looking at the land use conversion caused by the solar development. So to answer these questions, I looked at existing data sources. And so I found one in the production tracking system of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. And so this is a database of solar installations, including the data came online and also the general location, so zip code and town. However, there's no aerial information or exact location data. for each of the panels. So you really can't tell exactly where they are. And also submission is voluntary to the system. So there could be some gaps in knowledge of panels from that data. So another data source I looked at was the 2017 USDA Census of Agriculture to see if I could get any insights from that. And I found one interesting tidbit of information. So it shows that there's been a 3-fold plus increase of solar panels on active farms from 2012 to 2017. However, that does not include old farmland or farmland that's been sold off. So what I'm looking at is from the time even before that, land that could have been sold off but was originally agricultural. And so with my project, I'm going to be answering those types of questions. So what I hope to achieve with my project. So the first is a spatial data set of solar arrays in Massachusetts, an analysis and report on the development of solar arrays on agricultural land. And just to press the point, so when I talk about solar arrays, I mean ground-based solar arrays that would lead to land conversion, and not all solar arrays, say on rooftops or on pavement or anything like that. So I'm going to have to exclude those in my project. Now, how am I going to do this? Well, I could look through aerial imagery of all of Massachusetts and try to delineate all the solar panels, which would be very time consuming. But instead, what I will use with this, or what I'll need, is a method to automatically detect solar panels in aerial imagery. And this is where the great benefit of GIS and Python comes through. And so I found that the best method to achieve my goal of detecting solar panels in aerial imagery is a machine learning model that can perform semantic segmentation. Now, a lot of these terms get bandied about a bit, and some of them are interchangeable, and some people don't quite know what they mean. So I'll just give a few basic definitions. So machine learning is programming a computer to learn from data, and then having that program make predictions on new sets of data. So it's basically having like a miniaturized baby and teaching it the very basics of what is and what isn't. So it's classification. And so the second term in that sentence, semantic segmentation, that's just a fancy term for assigning pixels to a class. So I know in other GIS classes that I've had, I've seen classifying pixels and using the borderline pixels to assign a central pixel of value. So that's very similar to what's going on here, is that pixels are just assigned a value based on its neighboring area. And I just included that those humorous pictures on the side just to illustrate a more popular example of semantic segmentation. And so what's going on the right is a picture of a dog and a cat. And so online you can find all kinds of tutorials where you're given data sets of dogs and cats, and you train a classifier, a machine learning model, to determine whether or not the area inscribed in red, is that a dog or is that a cat? Now, of course, we understand that intuitively, but to train a model, you would need to give the model a lot of training data or examples to instantiate the image of a dog or a cat in the model. And so that leads me to the conversation about training. So in general, machine learning models require a lot of training data, and that's if they're supervised. And there's also a type called unsupervised machine learning. But in general, you need a lot of training data. And so why is that? Well, especially in aerial imagery, you can imagine that there are many features that can appear similar to the class you're looking for. So I have two examples on the right. One is of tennis courts, and another is of a pool compared to a solar panel. And so you can imagine looking at the tennis courts up there. Well, we can basically see that those aren't solar panels. But if you have a machine learning model, those could look darn near close. And so you would want to provide enough training data so that the model is aware of all the nuances of the solar panel, and so this can detect it accurately. And so, as I said, we're going to train for a variety of instances. So I looked at previous work in detecting solar arrays in aerial imagery using machine learning models. And so the first paper to accomplish this was Maloff et al. In 2015. And so, several subsequent papers have been published detecting solar panels in Brazil, in China, in Germany. And so Zek and Rinaldi in 2020 published a paper detecting solar panels in Oldenburg, Germany. And so I've contacted Professor Jordan Maloff, who's at Duke, and Professor Rinaldi, who is our own Joe Rinaldi, who works at Penn State Hazleton. And they've provided many useful insights to my project already. And I'll probably pester them further with emails in the future for help, but they've been very helpful. So in reviewing the literature, I've seen several different techniques, but I found that the most common machine learning technique that's been used is called a convolutional neural network. And I'll go into a bit what that is in a following slide. But before I do that, I just want to mention a little bit about my previous work. So in GEOG 487, I did a project where I manually annotated solar panels in aerial imagery. And I did this on a very small area of Massachusetts. And it was just kind of a test run. And in that image there with the map, you can see where I delineated solar panel footprints. And then where they're highlighted red, that is where the solar fields overlap former agricultural land. Now, in doing this project and seeing the amount of time it took, it led me to see that I needed a more efficient method to detect solar panels. And this kind of gave me the inspiration to find this method and do it as my capstone project. And so I already mentioned convolutional neural networks, but I just wanted to mention a few of the other potential models that I could use. So one is called a random forest model, which works off the concept of decision trees. And the other is a support vector machine, which works off the concept of decision planes. So both of those, random forest and support vector machines, are they're machine learning, but they're not deep learning. And in contrast, the convolutional neural network, which is based off neural networks, is a deep learning model. And that is the one that I chose to employ, primarily because it works best for complex tasks. And you can imagine that working with aerial imagery being as complex as it is, that would probably be a best fit. I also chose it because it's cutting edge and really the gold standard in image segmentation at the time. However, in contrast, it's also computationally expensive, and processing requires a lot of time and a lot of processing power. So I would have to balance some of the benefits of the network also with some of the downsides, which is you just need a very high level computing power. But as you can see on the far right, the convolutional network is the most complex of the three choices. So I'll go into a CNN, and so CNN is a network. It's not the television network. In this case, it's a machine learning model. And so the image that I have on the right is one model that I'll probably use. So this is the very popular UNet configuration. And so I won't go down into the nitty gritty details, but just to give you a flavor for what's happening here. So when you have a UNet model like this, an image is put in at the top right there, so the left leg of the U, and then the image goes down the left leg of the U, and so basically features are extracted out of the model in layers called convolutions, and then there are also pooling layers which perform downsampling. So basically further abstracting the features of the image. And so going up the right leg of the U, the image is reconstructed. And at the very end, you have what's called a classifier. And so at the very bottom right, you can see it says CONV conv 1 by 1. And so what that final layer produces is a confidence map of the pixels. So in my case, what it would be saying is a probability for every pixel of whether it's a certain class. So in my case, it's going to be, is it panel or not panel at that endpoint of the network? So I'll just go into a little bit of my project workflow. So the first step would be downloading the aerial imagery. And then I'll be creating training tiles, establishing the model architecture. I'll be training the models on annotated tiles, and then analyzing the output. So I've basically already referred to a lot of these tasks, but I'm just going to put them in sequential order and give a little bit more details. So the first step for me is to download the aerial imagery. And for this, I have MassGIS high resolution aerial imagery. And I'm going to use data from 4 years, 2008, 2013, 2019, and 2021. And this will be great for me because 2008 is the year when solar panels really started becoming popular. So I'll be able to see the progression of solar panels over time. So however, each of these data sets is quite large, over 100 gigabytes. So next, I'm going to create training tiles. So I'm going to manually annotate panel footprints in aerial imagery. Yes, so I have, in the end, I still have to do manual work with this. And so you can see on the right one example where from ArcGIS Pro image classification tool, where I started to annotate the panels. You can also increase the training data. So I'm going to augment it by performing some transformations of the training tiles. And one question I'll have to answer is how much percentage of the solar panel has to be in versus the background in the training tiles. So that's one area I'm going to have to investigate. So one caveat of this is that 2 data sets are in 30 centimeter resolution, while the other 2 are in 15 centimeter resolution. Both high resolutions, by the way. But the training data needs to be the same resolution. So one question I'm going to have to answer in my project is how I'm going to be able to do both. That's something that I'm going to have to work on when I'm actually building the model. So for the model architecture, I'm going to be using a Python-based environment, and specifically the TensorFlow library, which has lots of tools to implement machine learning. And so with its API, Keras, I'll be able to use these tools at a high level. So I'll be able to manipulate and implement a lot of this without having to know a lot of the hardcore calculus or very dense coding. I'll be able to use Keras in Python to be able to implement these. And so on the right, you can see a code sample of just the beginning of one of these models. And this one came from the TensorFlow tutorial where clothing was being classified. And so knowing I'm in good company, so Zeka Rinaldi and Iano Emiranidis, 4 researchers, used the a similar Python-based workflow to detect solar panels in their papers. So I hope to run a parallel project with mine. So next I'll train the model. And so what this means is that I'm going to feed the imagery, the training imagery into the model for several epochs. And an epoch is just a complete run through of all the data. And I'm going to check the performance metrics after each epoch. And so just to give an idea of a few of these. So recall is the ability of the classifier to find positive samples. So it's an ability to find solar panels in the imagery. Precision is the number of correct positive samples divided by the total number of samples. So how many did the classifier get right? And the F1 score is the harmonic mean of recall and precision. And that is basically a test for accuracy. So I can basically distill the performance down into one number, which is called a the output of a loss function. And in my case, I'll probably use mean squared error. And so you can think of the loss function as providing a window into the error of the model output. And so overall, you would want to minimize the loss function for the number of epochs that you conduct. And so finally, I'm going to analyze the output. So once I have the trained model, I'll feed the imagery, all of the imagery into it. And then I'll get a surface raster of classified pixels. So whether or not it's panel or not panel for each image. And then as a baseline for agricultural extent, I'll use a 2001 National Land Cover Database land use raster. And so this will give me just a background for the actual agricultural extent. And I'll look for overlap with array pixels from the latest data set. And so just another quick caveat. So I mentioned that the model will identify panel pixels, but I only want to identify ground-based arrays. So I'm going to have to figure out how to isolate those and probably provide more filtering in my model. So my final results include a shapefile of solar arrays, a CNN model to detect arrays in aerial imagery, and a report on solar panel development over time and occupancy of solar arrays. And so this is a project timeline. So I hope to start early in May and then continue with the research in the summer. By September, October, I hope to run the model on the actual image tiles. And then November, December, I'll work on my deliverables and perhaps present at a conference. And so I found 2 potential conferences. One is the 2022 ERISA conference in Boise, Idaho, and that's the Urban Regional Systems Association. And also the fall meeting of the Northeast ARC Users Group. So I'm going to have to determine which one would probably best fit for my project. So these are my references. And thank you for listening to my presentation.
Great job, Chet. Okay, do we have any questions? And you might need to stop sharing in order to be able to see the chat.
Oh.
I'm not sure. Sometimes people can and sometimes people can't.
Oh, let me see. How do I?
You should be able to find the stop sharing.
Oh, stop share. Thank you. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do I expect my results to reveal? Well, we'll probably find some overlap. I don't think that it will be mind-blowing amount of solar panels that are on agricultural land. But I think it's a good benchmark to see how much agricultural land actually has been converted. And if people actually know, if the public knows how much has been, then maybe they will reconsider doing, allowing more panels to be put out in the future. Yeah, so it took quite a while for me to understand these topics, and I'm still learning. And even experts I've talked to, that knowing the details is kind of it's tricky. It's very instance-based. Okay, so Anthony C. Robinson, a lot of demand for what you're doing. Yes, and so just talking with neighbors, seeing that they're want to know more about solar panels. And so I'm not anti-solar panel at all. And most of my neighbors are not. But just seeing that there is less regulation for it, and that there's kind of a scramble to put out more and more, it makes one think, okay, so what is actually going on? And is there anybody actually finding out how much is being done? And so with my project, I hope to find that out.
Any other questions? I know you listed 2 venues, Chad. How are you just basically going to figure out when you're done with the project to pick one of those, since one's earlier than the other, or is one of them more desirable?
Well, the one in New Hampshire is more desirable because it's closer.
Right, right.
But I'll have to see, because they have to post the topics for the conferences. And so I have to see if that aligns with my project or not, or even if they're accepting from like a non-professional. So that's what I'm going to have to see. But there aren't as many live in-person conferences out there.
Right, right. Okay. And are there any, I'm just curious, speaking of that, are there any conferences that you're aware of that were happening before COVID that just aren't back yet? Because we're kind of keen on figuring that out as far as the, how long we're going to have our online seminars.
So I think there's one actually at State College, but I think it's like in April or May. And so I won't be done by then. But I think there were some more like in Boston, in the Boston area, but they just haven't come back.
Okay. Yeah, that's what we'll be kind of keeping a close eye on, just to see how many options students have. It looks like Anthony has one more question.
Oh, sure. And so Anthony Robinson commented, do you plan to explore the intersections with policy incentives as well once you have mapped arrays? That is a very interesting angle to this, and I would like to. Just quick before my time runs out. One area where Massachusetts is pushing forth is the so-called dual use, where solar arrays can be put on agricultural land, but it's still classified as agricultural because you can grow plants in between them. And so that's something that's interesting that I may look into, but it is kind of a weedy area with the policy.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, it looks like your advisor might have a comment there.
Oh, yes. And thank you very much, Professor Walgren, for all of his support.
Excellent. Okay, so moving along here, the next presenter is James Progar. And so James, whenever you want to, or whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and start sharing and start your presentation.
Okay, all right. So I'm James Progar, and my project is a geodesign approach to post-industrial heritage-based bike trail tourism, Monongahela Valley, Perryopolis, and the Great Allegheny Passage Trail. Second here. Okay, so the Great Allegheny Passage is a trail running through southwestern Pennsylvania into Maryland. It crosses 5 counties and quite a few towns. As you can see on this slide there, surrounding the Gap Trail is the Trail Impact Zone, and that is comprised of not just the distance, but demographic and census data and an aggregation of that. That's how that's established. So I want to make that clear. Also, the trail runs along the Youghiogheny River, so the Youghiogheny River. So I want to address that as well. The Allegheny Trail Alliance sets the guidelines for the Trail Towns program, and the Trail Towns program is it's a form-based assessment, a self-assessment the towns can complete and then apply to get access to coordinated marketing efforts. And here you can see a sign that this is a Gap Trail Town, a town of West Newton. These are a cohesive set of towns with similar interests and a similar setup along the Gap Trail. There are tangible benefits to being part of the Trail Town system. Economic impacts by section. This is from the 2021 Great Allegheny Passage Economic Impact Report that reflects 2019 economic data. It's pretty significant for the Pennsylvania Laurel Highlands area, which is generally where we'll be talking about for my project. It generated about $78,000 per 1,000 residents. And it influences a change in home value. As you can see that in the chart on the right, home values increased nearly 40% in Connellsville between 2015 and 2019 versus 2009 to 2013. So pretty substantial increase in home values here. Next slide here. So the other pre-pandemic metrics that we have here, the Gap Trail generated $121 million in total economic impact. That is classified 3 ways: direct impacts, indirect impacts, and induced impacts. The direct impacts are that's spending by Gap tourists at businesses in the trail impact zone. Secondary purchases from businesses in the region, that's your indirect impacts, and then induced, that's household spending generated by direct and indirect impacts in the Gap region. So quite a bit of economic impact in this area. The return on investment for the Gap Trail. The initial cost to build the Gap Trail start to finish, $80 million. The annual economic impact is $121 million, which equates to about $800,000 generated per mile of the Gap Trail. And that results in about 1,400 living wage jobs. So the impact per mile is important to understand here, as that's a metric that can be used to calculate return on investment as we move forward. So like I said, the economic impact stats, that was derived from 2019 data, that's pre-pandemic. In 2020, a user count was performed. Ridership showed a 50% increase. That's a 500,000 user spike. The through riders, meaning start to finish, increased 86%. And since 2015, that's a yearly trend of 14%. So definitely gaining in popularity. Remains to be seen at this point if that will taper off, but the general trend being an increase over time. So linking this, linking the trail to the area's post-industrial heritage tourism. The region that the Gap Trail belongs to served the coal, coke, and steel industries in the 19th and early 20th century. And from research done by Bounds and Stevenson, they point to using material culture as a strategic and generative force for economic development. And Garner in 2013 linked historic preservation and trail tourism, suggesting that the trail will promote preservation efforts, and the preservation efforts then are reflected in by increased trail tourism. So it's sort of working together hand in hand to establish a trails popularity. We can compare and contrast here. These are different ways in which industrial heritage tourism can be displayed. So on the left, we have Bethlehem, PA at the Bethlehem Steelworks. Pretty elaborate use of preservation of post-industrial heritage, a dormant steelworks turn into a public green space, pretty elaborate. But the Susquehanna Greenway, also, it's a very successful regional trail that also uses industrial heritage. Some simpler, this photo represents a simpler example. So you can, it doesn't need to necessarily be the most elaborate piece of infrastructure. It can be very simple as well. The trail being established is the cultural turn, according to McLeod. The performative turn is the user perception. How does the user of the trail perceive the trail when they're using it? There's an increasing demand for more immersive experiences. And this can be exemplified through the use of smartphones, internet devices, such as tablets and smartphones, that you can have, what I want to say, sorry. You can have recorded messages and walking tours that don't need to necessarily have a guide, but are immersive experiences in their own right. The trails then become a consumable product. They're not just something that people use for exercise, but something that people use to visit and consume. And longer trails with more connections generally increase user activity. So the project goals are to establish regional connections with existing trails, model development for trail towns at multiple scales, and utilize the post-industrial heritage and material culture of the area to establish these trails. So the stakeholders that we have, residents of the area, local governments, this include boroughs, townships, at the county level as well, historical and heritage societies, Pennsylvania DCNR, DEP, and PennDOT. They all have a vested interest in this field. The Mon Valley Regional Chamber of Commerce, the Allegheny Trail Association, and the Still Valley Trail Council, and Rivers of Steel. Now, the bottom three are interesting because you could add more trail councils to this list. There are multiple trail councils. Every section that runs through every jurisdiction seems to have its own. So that's something that comes into play when we talk about the regional aspect of this here, because there usually is maybe competing interests in how the trail is established from one jurisdiction to the next. Rivers of Steel really sets the tone for placemaking in post-industrial heritage in southwestern Pennsylvania. So it's something to be aware of moving forward, to match some of their efforts and not to work against it. So the regional scale that I'm working at is the Monongahela Valley, or the Mon as it's referred to. So this section follows the Monongahela River And on this image, the Gap Trail that follows the Youghiogheny River to the east, you can see the proximity. So it's very close in proximity. There currently is no trail through Lamont. There's nothing connecting it, but there's definitely a proximity to the Gap Trail. And I also should point out before I move ahead that the buffer I have represents the Mid-Mon Valley, which is a 7-community area that if we think of the Rust Belt in America, this is the belt buckle. This is the main spot. This was the driver of the American steel industry for quite some time. So representation. It's a 130-mile river valley in southwestern PA. A lock and dam system negotiates the river, about a 200-foot elevation variance. The community population in this area ranges from about 1,000 people to 7,000 people. So a lot of post-industrial infrastructure, a lot of riverfront, waterfront area. Most of the industrial aspects and infrastructure are along the riverfront. And more recently, there was the development of the Mont-Fayette Expressway, which links this area to West Virginia, Morgantown, West Virginia, and to Pittsburgh. At the local scale, I'd like to explore Perryopolis. It's about a 1.5 square mile borough with the surrounding Perry Township. You can see the proximity here to both the Mon Valley and the Gap Trail. It's right along the Youghiogheny River. It's currently not identified as a trail town. It is not part of the program. It's not listed on any official Gap Trail literature. It's just kind of skipped over, so to speak. And as you can see from the figure on the left, it's kind of right in the middle of both the Mon and the Youghiogheny River. It's a place where we might be able to find some connection between the two and tie it together to match the impact zones. Population's approximately 1,700 people in the borough and 2,000 people in the surrounding Perry Township. This, like I said, it's located along the Youghiogheny River and the Gap Trail and along Route 51. That's a major corridor linking Pittsburgh to Uniontown. And as I mentioned, the Mon Expressway, it is kind of taken away traffic from Route 51. So Perryopolis is definitely losing the automotive traffic. There's also multiple historic sites just within the borough. There are 4 sites. In the surrounding township, there's even more. This property at one time was owned by George Washington. There's a grist mill on site that's been renovated and is essentially a working grist mill, but it's not accessible at the moment. It's surrounded by fence and barbed wire. So, process for the Mid-Mon Valley. It was the heart of the American steel industry in the 19th and earliest 20th centuries. It's a depopulating region. And I'll get to that on my next slide, but economically depressed. It's made up of 7 communities, and it's a lack of regional identity and cohesiveness, which has pointed out that the way that the the region operated was each individual town completed part of the process of the steelmaking process as materials were transferred north to Pittsburgh to be completed, usually at the Homestead Works just outside of Pittsburgh. And since the end of that industry, it has been the towns are competing against each other for a limited number of resources and funding for brownfield sites and other economic opportunities. So here we can compare and contrast, and this is something that I really want to dig into and point out. This is Donner Ave in Monessen, which is located on the Monongahela River. If the Mon Valley was the heart of the steel industry, Monessen was the heart of the Mon Valley. It's kind of how they identify themselves. You can see this photo taken on the left, taken roughly 1940. Monessen had a population of 20,000 people. Current day population is about 7,000. Between 1980 and 1986, the region as a whole lost over 100,000 jobs, 50% of which belong to the steel industry. So you see this transformation from this bustling downtown area. JFK visited in 1960 for a rally, to today, where a lot of the buildings have been demolished, and the building on the left-hand side in the foreground has trees growing through the second floor. So it's not in great shape. And what's interesting about this building, where I want to make a distinction between ruin gazing or even poverty gazing, is that this building was slated to be demolished. It was voted to be demolished in 2019. As of February of this year, it had been delayed yet again. So there's something with this building that is important to the people of Monessen and to the region, that it symbolizes the organization of life as the result of the industry. So it's not even so much that we're focusing on things like just infrastructure of the industry itself, but the organization of life as a result of that industry. So yeah, that's downtown Monessen. Looks pretty different. Perryopolis served the coal and coke industries. It was a bedroom community for most of its existence, meaning limited industry in the town itself, but the surrounding area, like I said, served the coal industry mostly. It's also depopulating, losing people every year. The borough and the township have somewhat competing interests, despite sharing the same region, the same area. The borough is slightly more dense, where the township is largely a rural area, and it owns most of the riverfront property as well. So there's some limitations to what the borough can do when it comes to its jurisdiction in property. It's made up of multiple communities. It's not just the township and the borough. Within that, there are multiple communities. Some of them have their own historic societies. Some of them have their own organizations for parks and recreation. So it's pretty competitive in that sense. It's an expansive school district. Some of the school district butts up against the Monongahela River. So very vast space, but we see that connection where the school district goes right up to the Mon River and looks across at a school across the river, but the students can't get there. It's lacking that infrastructure. And lastly, Perryopolis is kind of popular in movie scenes. Silence of the Lambs is the main thing that people know Perryopolis for. One of the Buffalo Bill House is located in Perryopolis, but it's been focal point of a couple of other recent movies. So kind of the way the town's set up, it has value as a movie setting. We can compare and contrast here. The photo on the left from the 1950s, I counted 17 cars in that photo. Current day doesn't look a ton different. It's missing some of the density, but still very car dependent, car centric community for being only 1.5 square miles in size. Now, this could be said that it's not as blighted as Monessen, but there are other issues that are here. For instance, being car focused and so close to the Gap Trail, it's not really navigable by bike. There's no real biking infrastructure. There's no bike lanes. There's no crosswalks. It's not pedestrian friendly. So trying to establish part of this, using it as a model to establish that where we don't lose the character of the town, but we can enhance what is there and make it easier for bikers and pedestrians. Evaluation, this goes for both areas, for both Amman and Perryopolis. Aging infrastructure, car dependent, low home values and blight, brownfield sites and gas wells. Fracking is the main economic driver of this area at this point. Mainly active wells, but a lot of abandoned wells as well that it caused some issues. But infrastructure is a major component here. This is Layton Bridge in connecting the town of Layton to Perryopolis. Layton's part of Perry Township, outside of the borough. It's the only connection. It's a single lane bridge. It's a bridge and tunnel connection, which is fairly rare, not all that common to see that. Single lane tunnel, single lane bridge. It doesn't really support the weight of emergency vehicles. It's slated to be replaced in 2025. It costs more to maintain it now than it would to just abandon it completely and rebuild. So that's the plan. But this is also a historic bridge and is recognized as such. And it's kind of one of the touch points of the area is Layton Bridge. It was recently featured in a Jason Momoa film on Netflix. So kind of something that's a emotional point for people, not really willing to give it up just yet. So some of the changes that we'll be seeing here, establish bike routes in urban and rural areas, identify regional greenway connections, identify gateways, portals, and paths as part of that greenway connection, encourage density in downtown areas, improve bike and pedestrian infrastructure, and highlight industrial heritage via view sheds and vistas. And it's important to add in the regional component. Mon Valley just lacking that regional aspect, sort of working as individual communities, not as a region. We can quantify our impacts here. Increased tourism economy with miles of trails added, increased home values over time, walkable communities we can track via crosswalks, sidewalks added, bike lanes added, increased density and proximity to amenities, a regional identity with connection to historic sites, a trail town identity. So we want to match what some of the things that the Allegheny Trail Alliance points out, sidewalks, adequate lighting, etc. And the economic projections. We can estimate the impact generated per person via the GAP trail metrics. We can use it as a baseline. That's a successful trail that's existed for quite some time now. So we can use it as a baseline. It's going to be some time before those numbers are met. In summary, regional scale, Mid-Mon Valley, local scale, Perryopolis, establishing a model for each, using Perryopolis sort of as a model for towns and villages, small areas in the Mid-Mon Valley to replicate and to look to, or a small population area, and how they're able to add connection to the GAP Trail. Using post-industrial heritage-based bike tourism to create an immersive experience for people. And we want to link that heritage back to the GAP Trail to create a more cohesive bike network within the region that will attract more people. Ultimately, decision makers will decide whether to implement the bike trail oriented tourism and use the bike trail as an economic driver as opposed to traditional highways and downtown areas. Build a trail network utilizing multiple trails that link together via nodes. Emphasize our post-industrial heritage, not just wiping it away, knocking things down, moving on from it, and replacing it but to emphasize it and include it as part of the design. Link to the Gap Trail, and then to establish that regional identity and have some oversight for the entire region to work together as a whole rather than individual communities. These are my references, and any questions?
Great job, James. You might need to stop sharing in order to see some questions.
Sure.
I don't see any there yet, but I'll just say I was very interested in this presentation. I thought it was really good. I'm actually from the Mon Valley. I'm from McKeesport, so specifically the confluence of the Mon and the Yaak. And it's kind of funny because my father-in-law is coming here today from there and would have loved to watch this presentation. So maybe you'll share it with me. He's an avid cyclist, or rides his bike on the trails around that area, and it would just absolutely love to watch this. I think this is really great that you're working on this, and I'll look forward to hearing how it goes.
I went to McKeesport High School, Beth.
No way.
Yeah. I'm from Dravosburg, but went
you know
to
what?
McKeesport.
David did tell me that, actually. And so I always wanted to chat with you about it.
Okay,
So
not the time, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to
Anyway.
not take over James's presentation, but yeah, we should chat.
Yeah.
James, so I don't know if I think you knew this. I worked on the Mon-Fayette Expressway professionally through 5 design advisory teams on that Mon Valley. We work with the Rivers of Steel group for their trails, and that was one of the reasons. I mean, we looked at that. Highways are not exciting projects. They're kind of what was a necessary evil for what we were working on. It paid well, actually, but we were looking at that more as a corridor. How do we get that corridor in the right place, in the right size? Can we actually use couldn't use the median, but we could use adjacencies to actually try to snake this trail through this larger planning project, including eminent domain and other things that were not so pretty, to actually make this trail connect better. Ambitious project. And one of the things that we are always having to try to rationalize is, what are the points of destination on this trail? Now, you talked about towns as destinations, but being able to create these nodes, kind of pearls on a necklace, to say these are the things that we're trying to link together in this trail. And it could be themed, it could be based on movie sets, it could be based on other cultural resources, it could be city centers, like little places to actually promote growth. Because if you are a node on this trail, then you can have a shop or a business or a bike shop or something that can help with that. I noticed you also had portals and access points. Those will be clearly shown. And so I guess the question is, that starts adding the geospatial data to start driving that corridor. It starts also adding, just more purpose to the project, but also, like I said, you talk about the process models, we need to start building up that data and actually talk about, I won't talk about suitability analysis, but talk about why that trail needs to connect where it needs to go. And these are the best, this is the best route. And there may not be the best route, but yeah.
I'm aware that one of the issues with some of the redevelopment in the region as a whole, or the Pittsburgh region as a whole, has been that as people attempt one project, extra things start getting added into it in the industry, like when you're talking about industrial heritage, because there's so much in the area that even when I'm thinking about Perryopolis, I'm thinking about this George Washington side of it and the coal and coke industry side of it. So I think that there can be multiple things going on at the same time. And outside of the suitability analysis, I think that if you're creating a network, like the research pointed to, that additional longer, and not necessarily lengthwise, but time spent, places where there are multiple trails, it's only going to add to it. So I think that kind of my idea here would be, even when we're looking at the gap over to the Mon Valley, there's a pretty defined space in between that you could build out an elaborate network, really. It's a low cost implementation, and the return on investment is really high for these areas to put something together where, in my mind, I don't know that the area jumps out at people as this, this trail oriented area. It's there, it's clearly making money, but I don't know that it seems like that. But I think the more trails that get added in there, I think only elevate it and only encourage more trails, really. I don't know if that, does that answer the question?
Tangentially, we'll talk. I know we're out of time here. I know the next presenter has to come. So of course I could talk through our groups.
Yeah, and it looks like Jan Walgren has a question, so you can get to that before we move on.
Okay, Jan asked, when you mentioned immersive approaches, would that include smartphone-based augmented reality apps? I could see that working really well with industrial heritage, but was wondering whether you know of projects where this is already used in a similar context. I'm not sure that I know of augmented reality projects off the top of my head, but I know that that is something that can be done. And I know that there's a lot of that. I know in State College, just for instance, the walking tour of mid-century modern homes really kind of piqued my interest into the immersive experience and how people navigate that. So it's definitely something that could be done.
I have a paper to share with you, James, on that exact topic. So
Okay.
We'll talk later.
Okay, all right.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks again, James. We will go ahead and move on to our last presenter of today, Krista Weidemer. So Krista, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share and start talking.
Hello, everyone. Okay, get my thing all set up here. All right, everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. So my project is on the impact of commercial mixed-use development projects on the price of nearby residential real estate within Washington, D.C. So first I'll go through a brief outline, just kind of the topic overall, then I'll go over my designated research questions. I'll talk about my previous literature reviews and things like that. Then I'll review the data sets and methodology and explain my anticipated results before moving on to my project timeline. So the Washington, D.C. population overall has been growing every year since 2016. Between 2010 and 2020 alone, the district saw a population increase of over 14%. This is kind of in contrast to a pattern of urban sprawl that was observed in the early 2000s. During that time period, a lot of people left the city and you saw the greater DC metropolitan area expand outside the Beltway, if you're familiar with the area. And now some people live over an hour away or 40, 50 miles away, and they're still considered within the greater Metro DC area. So that was in the early 2000s. And then in the 2010s, there was a great migration of millennials moving back into the district itself. The later half of the 2010s experienced a little bit of a slowed or tapered population increase. There were a few people moving outside the district, but there was a pretty steady population boom based off of a relatively high local birth rate, and that was greater than the rate of people leaving or passing within the district. So it's still steadily increased. The growing population has created a high demand for residential housing, causing property values to skyrocket. And as of 2020, Washington, D.C. was determined to be the second least affordable state or territory within the United States when measured as a rate of median household income as a percentage of median home price. Businesses have really responded to the growing population within DC. There are an endless array of restaurants. There are new special event facilities such as concert halls and sports venues. The open public spaces have been expanding and being redeveloped as far as parks and things like that. Additionally, both historic buildings have been renovated for office buildings, as have there been new developments of snazzy new, very architecturally forward office buildings. So kind of covering all sorts of bases there, really trying to appease to the growing population. This population boom is not forecasted to plateau anytime soon. As of December 2020, there was an estimated $47.4 billion invested in development projects, either under construction or in the pipeline phase. In the image here, that's the gray and the orange shaded region. So that's over in the past, since the year 2000. That's even just a small portion of what's already been developed as well. I personally have been very interested in this idea or this topic because I moved to Washington, D.C. about 4 years ago from State College. Did not buy because it's crazy here, but it's just kind of a very different market. And I live between two very fast growing areas, the Wharf and the Navy Yard. So both those areas have undergone very big redevelopment projects, the multi-billion-dollar projects, and those areas in particular have become really hot markets for the housing prices. And I'm in between them in an older part of the city where there's less mobility and things like that. So it's been really interesting to watch the very drastic contrast between the two areas that are surrounding me. There has been a little bit of government influence in trying to persuade or guide where new development ends up going for social reasons. So in 2017, US Congress passed a bill aimed to stimulate economic growth and social diversity in suffering or underutilized communities by establishing these opportunity zones across all 50 states and US territories. This program provides grants, tax credits, and other incentives to development and general contractor companies to plan projects in marginalized neighborhoods. This includes areas in which population have a lower mean household income, areas that are comprised of more renters and owners, areas with a larger number of older or more decrepit buildings, and the like. Public officials in support of opportunity zones consider the program a community investment. The government's lost revenue due to tax breaks and other financial program benefits are thought to be small investments whenever thinking about the greater overall return of the growing areas and the economic impact for these pockets of the city. On the other hand, opponents of opportunity zones worry that the dazzling new buildings and facades and new development will lead to gentrification and force out people who are originally or currently living in the areas, and it'll kind of force those out of the region and price people out of the region that have lived there for several generations. On a national scale, there are greater concerns about political influences. On the state level, there have been patterns reported of opportunity zones being established in parts of certain states where the local state's representative is of the same political party as the state governor. That's not so much of an issue in DC because it's just the district and it's run by the mayor, and the mayor oversees the district, which serves as both the local and the state level, essentially. However, there are other critics who think there are other underlying political influences and influences as far as the development projects themselves, big money influencing where these opportunity zones are established. So I've established two research questions for this project. The first one is, do commercial and mixed-use developments, single-family townhomes, and condominium units, do they increase in value whenever they are close to a new development? So essentially, is there a direct correlation between residential values and these new development buildings? My second question is, do commercial and mixed-use developments and opportunity zones impact changes in home values for single-family home and condominium residences? So within the study, as discussed previously, it will cover many different types of residential properties, not just single-family homes. Just based off of the DC market, some neighborhoods are strictly single-family homes, and then other portions of the city are very much not single-family homes. They're mostly condos and the like. So in order to get an even representation throughout the city, it was decided that we would cover all home property prices or types. Additionally, a home being near a new development project will be established as a home within a half a mile of the new commercial property or mixed-use property. Price changes will be measured from the seller's perspective, so it'll be a positive impact will be an increase in property value. And additionally, most of the real estate market value trends will be established and viewed by the ANC level, the Advisory Neighborhood Commission level. So these ANCs are subdivisions from the 8 Washington, D.C. wards, each of which have a nonpartisan elected official who serves as a voice for the neighborhood in an effort to bridge the gap between the government officials and the general public. Housing data was deliberately chosen to be compiled at this level because of the strong, unique sense of identity through each neighborhood of DC. Conducting an analysis based on street block or just strictly a linear distance would not translate to, or would not accurately translate to the DC dynamics and terrain. A lot of DC on a two-dimensional map may look like two regions are right close to each other. However, it can be very broken up based on parkways or freeways or tunnels and things like that. So ANCs, as shown here, very distinctly group neighborhoods based on their neighborhood identity. A preliminary review of the data set determined that one of the 40 ANCs units should be omitted from the proposed study due to insufficient data. ANC 2C here in the center of the district, that is the ANC that was omitted. Within an 8-year span between 2013 or to 7-year span between 2013 and 2019, there was a recorded single-family medium home sale for just 2 non-consecutive years. So there really isn't a lot of residents in this area. From the inset here, from the aerial view. So the diagonal street kind of going through the ANC blocks off a lot of federal buildings and the National Mall. Above it are a lot of other federal buildings and local government buildings as well. So most of this area does not really have any residential home properties. Urban commercial development projects are overall intended to benefit both the micro neighborhood area in which they are located and the city as a whole by revitalizing an outdated or underused area. These projects aim to attract more visitors and entice residents to relocate to the revitalized areas in attempts to inject money into the local economy, increase diversity, and create jobs. Subsequently, these results in increased property values for the surrounding residential real estate area. Previous studies have researched the magnitude of this impact in cities around the world, including Houston, Toronto, Seoul, South Korea, and Atlanta. All of those studies have found an increase in property value, an overall increased property value for properties located near new development projects. Other studies have explored the positive impact on home values based on specific neighborhood amenities. One such study looked into the prevalence of bike sharing and how that impacted property values, specifically in New York City, whenever that is, which is a location where bike sharing is much more important and much more used than, car sharing and things like that. Another study has looked into specialized development projects, minor league baseball sports stadiums, and that again also found a increase in home value whenever located near to a sports stadium. One thing that was unique about this study, though, the Van Holm study, was that it compared prices prior to the stadium's construction and then housing prices a decade after the project was completed. So that was a little unique because it allowed plenty of time for changes within the area and market changes to respond. And that's something that I definitely want to take into consideration throughout my study. Other previous studies have talked or discussed and studied the type of development project used and how that impacts the surrounding home prices. So Wiley in particular studied new development and categorized new development into 3 categories, either industrial, office space, or retail space. In this paper, Wiley found that industrial developments had a rather insignificant impact on nearby housing prices in Atlanta, while the addition of office spaces initially caused a small increase in property value. However, this very quickly plateaued after just a few short years. Conversely, the addition of retail space definitely increased property value, and it did not plateau. It just continued to grow for quite a few years following the project completion. Additionally, this study, the Wiley study, found that the positive impact of the retail spaces also had a spillover effect. So it had a positive impact on the neighboring but still distinctly separate neighborhoods. Wiley hypothesized that developers of certain projects types, whether it be commercial, office space, or retail, use this information in order to guide the site selection for such project, kind of implying that certain industries will seek out neighborhoods of a certain type, whether that be a neighborhood that with cheaper existing real estate or more expensive existing real estate. And that is something that we're expected to also observe in this study as well. There was one study that sought to determine if opportunity zones the opportunity zone, pardon me, the opportunity zone designation attracted property buyers to specific neighborhoods. This study was kind of built upon a research project from 1985 that said that the current day value of property would increase a small amount, a marginal amount, in anticipation of the future increase of property value. So that is something that will be explored in this study as well. So I propose that properties that are located near a project that is established to be in the pipeline, we'll see a small increase in property value. And then once the project has completed construction, the nearby housing values will increase much more drastically. So this will mostly be in response to real estate investors who foresee the future increase and then act and buy property for a short term, hoping to sell for a very great profit once the project is completed. All right. So after the data is compiled and pulled together, a hedonic model will be used to isolate what margin of the change in real estate is attributed to the proximity to a new development project. Hedonic modeling is one of the most widely used methods for establishing a home's market value because it incorporates both intrinsic property values such as roof material, the quality of appliances, age, number of bedrooms, things like that, and combines it with external factors such as proximity to schools, flood zone risks, and access to major commuter routes. This method uses a function to determine the magnitude to which an independent variable, such as a distance to a new development project, impacts the function's dependent variable, which is the overall property sale price. One of the many reasons that this model is favored is because the model is customizable based on the parameters of a certain study. These hedonic models are limited though, however, because they do not factor any sort of patterns of spatial autocorrelation, which prevents results from being compared directly between distinct data entries. And one form of spatial autocorrelation commonly present in real estate is spatial heterogeneity, which is basically stating that properties that are near to each other tend to have very similar property values because they tend to be built of a similar style or of a similar age, or even the same developer. To account for this, the proposed study will incorporate Moran's I to identify any sort of autocorrelation patterns that may be amplifying or diminishing the outputs of the hedonic model. Dubé and Legros conducted a study and explored the applications of Moran's I to the hedonic model regressions in order to nullify any sort of impact of temporal dimensions on the autocorrelation patterns. That would be particularly helpful in this study because the temporal influences are already being measured based on the changes to the surrounding areas, as in the changes to the community resources and development projects. The programs and tools used for this project. So I will use RStudio for the hedonic regression model. And then with those outputs, GitHub will be used for the autocorrelation, the Moran's eye. The results will then be displayed and developed in ArcGIS for mapping and presentation purposes. Data sets for this study will be pulled from a variety of both public sources and then also local nonprofit organizations. So here the Open Data DC and will be providing the geolocation of commercial and multi-use development projects. So it's just basically a massive database of the current projects and the zoning region that they're, or the project type they are zoned for, and the like. And then the Office of Tax and Revenue will be used to pull real estate property sale values. Overall, just a giant record of all property sales within the district. From that, we'll have to sort through the specific residential properties and then subdivide them based on whether they're single family homes, townhomes, co-ops, or condominium residences. Additionally, we'll get sources from the WDCEP. It's an annual report. The most recent annual report available is the 2020 to 2021 report. It provides summary data of development projects. That is where the majority of the data is comes from, where it is broken into the 3 different distinct phases of whether the project is completed, under construction, or in the pipeline. Additional real estate data will be provided by the Urban Institute of Greater DC. It'll just provide additional information and help classification of real estate property types, whether it be condo, co-op, or single family homes. Going back here. So all of the data sets for the study will be pulled or extracted all at once. That is because the data sets are updated almost constantly. And so we want the data to all be reflective of a single point in time. I didn't want to pull some data of real estate property sales value now, and then at a later point in time, try and pull the development projects data set, because it wouldn't accurately reflect the changes in real estate values based off of the completion of certain projects. Say the project was completed in May, housing prices might then change in June or July. So I would kind of want to then re-pull the data set. So in order to avoid any sort of impact or changes or gaps within the data, all of it is going to be pulled at once. As far as anticipated results for whether the commercial mixed-use development projects positively impacting residential home values, yes, is very much hypothesized that new commercial and mixed-use developments will increase property value for nearby homes. However, this trend is expected to vary throughout the district. So development buffer zones located in ANCs with higher mean property values prior to the announcement of a new development project are expected to experience a greater % increase in property value when compared to ANCs with lower median property values pre-development. In response to the second question of do commercial mixed-use developments and opportunity zones impact changes in home values for single-family townhomes and condominium residences? No, not in this study per se. So it is not expected to, there's not expected to be an observable change in property values or distinction between changes in home prices for opportunity zones versus homes not near an opportunity zone. This is largely due to the age of the opportunity zone program. The program itself is less than 5 years old, so it hasn't not been enough time for people to recognize or identify any sort of changes, because many projects that may have been influenced or decided to the establishment and opportunity zone in response to the government incentives may not be completed yet or even under construction yet. My timeline for this project, so I'm now presenting the capstone presentation. I'm hoping to gather and organize the data, clean the data through May and June. In July, I will really start playing with the data, putting them through the regression models and things like that. In August, I'll identify the outputs, probably have to re-execute some of the functions based off of, removing any sort of outliers and things like that. In September, I will compile the outputs, such as the maps and tables and things like that. In October, I will organize findings. In the fall 2 semester of this year, I will take the second part of this course, and I'll just kind of compile everything, finish the presentation project, and then hopefully find a local event to speak at. It just kind of depends on obviously what's going on and if there are available conferences to speak at in the local area. But if not, I know I'll be able to present in another format. Here are my references. And any questions from anybody?
Great job, Krista. If you stop sharing, it looks like Brandy already has a question there.
All right, let's see here. I have yet to decide if I'll run any sort of global regressions. It just kind of depends on the amount of data that will be available. The projects that are out there. It is expected that there is going to be a large or a great deal of differences between the different ANCs and the opportunity zones. I don't know if I could pull it back up, but the opportunity zones are very much on the northeastern part of the city and the southeastern part of the city that are across the river, as a lot of people say. So it kind of makes the data throughout the city very, very different to compare. So we'll just kind of have to see how things are looking once everything is pulled. And see another question. So it sounds like you're planning to use R for the initial analysis and then inputting that data into ARC. Am I correct in that? Why did you choose to do that method? Mostly personal preference. I have worked with ARC the most, so I just kind of like using ARC. And I also think that for display purposes, in order to interpret the data, I think there's just a few more options in ARC. I know they are available in R as well, but again, it's just kind of a personal preference. Any other questions?
I was just curious, you said that this is about 5 years old, the opportunity zones. Is the public aware of this kind of thing? Like how visible is this?
So there is a nationwide database of this information, but the public is aware in DC because of the format of the local government. It was kind of they did try and seek community input of where to establish opportunity zones actually. So it was fairly visible on to the general public within DC. However, I don't think that's very much the case in other areas. I did look at opportunity zones in PA because that's where I'm from, and I was kind of shocked to find that the downtown State College area between like Beaver and College Avenue is an opportunity zone, which I personally don't perceive as an area that's struggling or anything like that. So I was kind of confused by that, and I didn't really realize that was a thing until I looked up this looked into the opportunity zone program.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Pretty much perfect timing. So yeah, I look forward to seeing how that goes, Krista. Okay, well, thank you to everybody. Our next set of presentations is Monday evening, starting at 6:30. I'm going to paste, so I put the link to the peer review form in the chat earlier. Right now, I'm going to put the link to the Capstone Project Library because that is where the recordings of all of these are going. So the recording from yesterday is in there now, so you can see that from the 3 presenters from yesterday. And as soon as this is done processing, then I will post the link to this one in there today, and so on and so forth. So if you do have evaluations to fill out for other students in the class and you aren't able to see one or more of them live, you can go there and grab the recording. But thanks again for coming and have an excellent weekend.